The worst part about being abandoned on your first date isn't the empty chair across from you. It's realizing everyone else in the room noticed before you did. I remember staring at the glowing screen of my phone while the restaurant lights reflected off the glass like tiny stars I didn't ask for. 7:42 p.m. That was the last message Jason had sent. Parking is crazy. Be there in 5. 5 minutes turned into 15, then 30, then almost an hour, and the polite smile I had practiced in the mirror that afternoon slowly began to feel like something glued to my face. The place was one of those trendy downtown spots where the menus don't even list prices, and every table has a candle that smells faintly like vanilla. I had spent 40 minutes driving through traffic just to get there, another 10 circling the block looking for parking, and now I sat alone in a navy dress that suddenly felt like a bad decision. Around me, the restaurant buzzed with quiet laughter, clinking glasses, and conversations that floated through the air like they belonged to another world. A couple at the next table leaned closer together, sharing a dessert with 2 forks. Someone at the bar laughed loudly. The waiter passed by twice, each time giving me that careful look servers give when they're trying to figure out if you're still waiting for someone or if you've already been stood up. I checked my phone again. Nothing. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to take a sip of water like it was completely normal to sit at a candlelit table alone on a Friday night. Maybe there had been an emergency. Maybe his phone died. Maybe. You waiting for someone who's not coming? The voice didn't come from my phone. It came from the table to my right. I hadn't noticed the man sitting there before, which was strange because once I looked up it became impossible not to notice him. He sat with the kind of quiet confidence that made the entire room seem slightly smaller around him. Dark suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. White shirt sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. He wasn't smiling exactly, just watching. I felt heat rush to my cheeks. He's just running late, I said quickly, the lie coming out smoother than I expected. The man tilted, his head slightly, studying me like someone trying to solve a puzzle. His eyes were dark and calm, the kind of calm that didn't look accidental. Late, he repeated softly, as if testing the word. I looked down at my phone again to avoid that gaze. 7:58 p.m. now. A new message finally appeared on the screen. For half a second relief washed over me, until I opened it. Actually, I'm gonna pass tonight. Don't think we're really a match. Take care. That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just 12 words that managed to make the empty chair across from me feel twice as loud. I swallowed hard and set the phone face down on the table, determined not to let my expression crack in front of strangers. But when I looked up again, the man at the next table was still watching me. Not with pity. Not with curiosity. Something else. Something quieter. Like he had been paying attention long before the message appeared. And somehow, that made my heartbeat stumble even more than the text itself. I should have left right then. Any normal person would have stood up, grabbed their coat, and walked out of that restaurant pretending the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. But something about the way the man at the next table was watching me made it strangely difficult to move. Not threatening. Not intrusive. Just observant. Like he had already read the entire story written across my face before I even finished reading that message. I cleared my throat and forced a small laugh that sounded thin even to my own ears. Modern dating, I said quietly, mostly to the table, mostly to myself. Apparently people cancel after you already ordered the appetizer. The man studied me for another moment before glancing briefly at the empty chair across from me. When he spoke again, his voice stayed low and calm. The kind of voice that did not need to compete with the noise of the restaurant to be heard. You drove here tonight, he said. It was not phrased like a question. I blinked in surprise. How do you know that? His eyes moved toward the window where the streetlights reflected across the polished floor. You checked your phone for parking updates 3 times when you sat down, he said simply. And you looked toward the street every few minutes after that. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. That was unsettlingly accurate. So what you are saying, I replied slowly, is that you have been watching me this whole time. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. Observing, he corrected. There is a difference. I picked up my water glass again, just so my hands had something to do. Well, observation concluded, I said. The date is officially over. I tried to make the words sound casual, like the message on my phone had not landed like a quiet punch to the chest. But I could still feel the sting of it sitting there between us, invisible but obvious. The waiter appeared again beside the table, polite and careful. "Would you like another few minutes?" he asked gently, clearly unsure whether my date had simply stepped away. I hesitated. Saying yes would mean sitting there longer pretending someone might still walk through the door. Saying no meant admitting out loud that I had been stood up. Before I could answer, the man beside me spoke. "Bring her the chocolate cake," he said calmly. The waiter looked confused. "Sir." "The chocolate cake," the man repeated. "And coffee." I turned toward him immediately. "You do not have to do that." His gaze met mine again, steady and unreadable. "I know." That simple response made it oddly difficult to argue. The waiter nodded and disappeared toward the kitchen. I shook my head, half embarrassed and half amused. "You realize that makes this situation even stranger," I said. "A mysterious man ordering dessert for a woman he does not know." "Vincent," he said. It took me a second to realize he had just given me his name. "Emily," I replied automatically. Vincent leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands on the table as if we had simply planned to meet there all along. The candlelight reflected softly across the edge of his watch, something expensive looking but understated. "Emily," he repeated thoughtfully, like he was committing the name to memory. For the record, he made a mistake. I felt my eyebrows lift. "You do not even know him." "I do not need to," Vincent said. "Anyone who leaves someone sitting alone like that does not understand value." The statement was delivered so matter-of-factly that it caught me off guard. Most people would have tried to make a joke or offered sympathy. Vincent said it like a quiet conclusion. The waiter returned with a small plate holding a slice of chocolate cake and a cup of coffee. The smell alone made the evening feel a little less sharp around the edges. I looked down at the dessert, then back at Vincent. "Are you always this confident about strangers?" He shrugged lightly. "Only when the evidence is clear." I picked up the fork and took a small bite. It was warm, rich, and unexpectedly comforting. For the first time in the last hour, my shoulders relaxed a little. Vincent watched me for another moment. Then his attention shifted briefly toward the front entrance of the restaurant. Something in his expression changed. It was subtle, quick, but I noticed it. The calm focus in his eyes sharpened slightly, like someone recognizing a problem before anyone else in the room realized it existed. When his gaze returned to me, his voice lowered just enough that only I could hear it. "Emily," he said quietly, "did the man who sent that message mention anything about who he was meeting tonight after he left you here?" The question landed strangely. Not casual, not random, and suddenly the room felt just a little bit different. I did not answer Vincent right away. The question hung between us like a note that did not belong in the music of the restaurant. Around us people were still laughing softly, waiters still carrying plates, glasses still clinking together in quiet celebration of Friday night plans that had nothing to do with mine. But suddenly it felt as if I had stepped half an inch outside that world, and Vincent was the only person who had noticed. I set my fork down slowly. "No," I said. "Why would he mention that?" Vincent did not immediately reply. His eyes moved again toward the front entrance, then toward the bar, scanning the room in a calm, deliberate way that made it clear he was not simply people watching. He was evaluating something, measuring it, the same way someone studies the sky before deciding whether a storm is coming. "Sometimes," he said after a moment, "people change plans when they think something better is available." I frowned slightly. "I am not sure that makes sense in this situation." Vincent looked back at me then, the faintest trace of humor touching his expression. "It rarely does." I reached for my coffee, buying myself a second to think. The warmth of the cup felt steady in my hands, grounding in a way the evening had not been until that moment. "You are speaking like you know him," I said carefully. Vincent shook his head once. "I do not." "Then why ask?" For a moment he seemed to consider how much to say. I noticed something then that I had not paid attention to earlier. Two men had entered the restaurant about a minute ago and taken a table near the back wall. They wore dark jackets and spoke quietly to each other while scanning the room in a way that reminded me of Vincent earlier. Not aggressive, just alert. Vincent followed my gaze briefly before returning his attention to me. "Because the man who left you here might have made a decision tonight that will not end well for him," he said calmly. My stomach tightened again, but for a completely different reason this time. "That sounds dramatic," I said lightly, though my voice did not sound nearly as confident as I intended. Vincent leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice again. "Emily, I am going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." The seriousness in his tone erased the last of the casual mood between us. I nodded slowly. Did he ask you any unusual questions when you were messaging earlier today? I replayed the conversation in my mind. Jason had been normal, maybe a little too eager to know exactly which restaurant we were meeting at, but that seemed reasonable at the time. Then something else surfaced in my memory. He asked where I parked. I said slowly. Vincent did not react immediately, but something in his expression sharpened again. What exactly did he say? I pulled my phone back into my hand and scrolled through the messages until I found it. He said the neighborhood can be difficult for parking and wanted to know if I used the street garage across the block. Vincent read the message over my shoulder without touching the phone. When I looked up again, his gaze had gone very still. Did you? Yes, I admitted. It was the only place with open spots. Vincent leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose like someone confirming a suspicion. That is unfortunate. Timing. A cold thread of unease slipped down my spine. You are starting to worry me, I said quietly. Vincent held my eyes for a moment. Then his voice softened just enough to sound reassuring without losing its certainty. Do not be worried. Just stay here for a few minutes longer. I glanced toward the entrance again, then back at him. Vincent, I said slowly, what exactly do you think is happening tonight? He watched me for another second before answering. I think, he said calmly, the man who left you here may have planned something that involves your car. My heart skipped. What does that mean? Vincent stood then, smooth and controlled, already reaching for his jacket. It means, he said quietly, you are not walking to that garage alone tonight. I hesitated for only a second before standing as well. Something in Vincent's tone made it clear that arguing would not change his mind, and the quiet certainty in his voice had a strange effect on me. It was the kind of certainty people only had when they already knew more than they were saying. The restaurant suddenly felt warmer than it had a moment ago, the air thicker, the soft music less comforting. I grabbed my purse from the back of the chair and followed him as he slipped his jacket on with an easy, practiced motion. As we stepped away from the table, I noticed the two men near the back wall rise at the exact same moment Vincent did. They did not approach us directly, but they moved toward the exit with the same calm purpose, like passengers boarding the same train without speaking about it. Outside the restaurant the night air was cool and carried the faint smell of rain on pavement. Streetlights reflected across rows of parked cars and the steady stream of traffic moving through downtown. The parking garage sat half a block away across the street, its concrete levels glowing under harsh fluorescent lights that made everything inside look pale and distant. I stopped on the sidewalk and looked at Vincent. You are going to have to explain something, I said. He glanced toward the garage for a moment, then back at me. Your car is parked on the third level, he said. I blinked in surprise. How would you know that? Vincent gestured lightly with one hand toward the entrance. Ramp. That garage rarely has open spaces on the first two levels after 7 in the evening, he said calmly. Probability. I narrowed my eyes slightly. You make it sound like mathematics. Most problems are, he replied. The two men who had stood earlier crossed the street ahead of us, disappearing into the garage without looking back. I watched them go before turning to Vincent again. Your friends seem very interested in where I parked too. Vincent did not follow my gaze. They are making sure we arrive without surprises. I folded my arms slightly, unsure whether to laugh or feel concerned. Vincent, I met you less than an hour ago, and now you are talking like we are walking into some kind of operation. He met my eyes then, steady and calm as always. Emily, you trusted a man you barely knew enough to meet him alone tonight. That landed more sharply than I expected. That is different, I said quietly. Vincent tilted his head slightly. Is it? I opened my mouth to respond, but realized I did not have a good answer. Instead, I sighed and glanced toward the garage entrance again. Fine, I said. Let us assume you are right, and something strange is happening with my car. What exactly are you expecting to find? Vincent stepped closer to the curb, scanning the traffic before crossing. Hopefully nothing. We walked across the street together, the echo of our footsteps changing as we stepped onto the smooth concrete floor of the garage. The lighting inside was brighter but colder, rows of vehicles parked in long silent lines beneath numbered signs hanging from the ceiling. Level 1. The air smelled faintly of motor oil and damp cement. Our footsteps carried through the open space as we approached the stairwell that led upward. I noticed Vincent pause for just a moment near the entrance as one of the men from earlier spoke quietly to him. I could not hear the words, but Vincent nodded once before the man continued walking ahead toward the ramp. Vincent turned back to me. "We will take the stairs," he said. I followed him up the first flight, my heels clicking softly against the metal steps. By the time we reached the second level, my earlier embarrassment from the restaurant had completely faded, replaced by a tight curiosity that kept pulling my attention toward Vincent. "You still have not told me why you think Jason would care where I parked," I said. Vincent stopped briefly on the landing between levels 2 and 3. For the first time that night, his expression looked slightly more serious than calm. "Because people rarely ask that question unless they expect someone else to visit the car before its owner does." My stomach tightened. "You think someone is waiting up there?" Vincent shook his head once. "I think someone expected you to arrive alone." He opened the stairwell door to the third level and stepped aside slightly so I could see the row of vehicles ahead. "Which," he said quietly, "is why tonight did not go according to their plan." I stepped through the stairwell door slowly, the echo of the metal hinge fading behind us as the third level of the garage stretched out in front of us. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting long white reflections across rows of parked cars. For a moment, nothing moved. The space looked completely ordinary, just another late evening in a downtown parking structure where people had left their vehicles while they ate dinner somewhere nearby. But the quiet felt different now that Vincent had said those words. "Someone expected you to arrive alone." I scanned the rows until I spotted my car about 40 feet away, a silver sedan sitting between a pickup truck and a compact hatchback. "That is mine," I said, pointing toward it. Vincent followed my gesture, but did not immediately walk forward. Instead, he studied the area the same way he had studied the restaurant earlier, calmly observing every corner of the level. One of the men who had entered the garage ahead of us was already walking along the far row of vehicles, hands in his pockets like someone who had simply forgotten where he parked. The other stood near the ramp entrance, glancing casually toward the street below. None of it looked dramatic, yet the quiet coordination between them made the entire space feel less random than it had seconds earlier. Vincent finally nodded once and began walking beside me. Our footsteps echoed softly against the concrete floor as we moved closer to the car. My pulse picked up even though I could not see anything unusual yet. "You still have not explained why someone would care about my car," I said quietly. Vincent kept his eyes forward. "Because sometimes the easiest way to learn about someone is to see where they go next," he replied. I frowned slightly. "You think Jason wanted someone to follow me?" Vincent did not answer immediately. When we reached the row where my car sat, he slowed, glancing at the vehicles on either side before stopping a few feet away. "Emily," he said calmly, "where exactly did you park earlier?" I pointed toward the same spot again. "Right there." Vincent studied the ground for a moment before stepping forward. I followed half a step behind him until we stood beside the driver's side door. At first, everything looked normal. The windows were closed, the mirrors in place, the car exactly the way I had left it earlier that evening. I let out a small breath of relief. "See," I said quietly. Nothing happened. Vincent crouched slightly near the front tire without replying. His hand brushed the concrete lightly as he looked beneath the edge of the car. "Vincent," I said, a little confused. "What are you looking for?" He stood again after a moment and turned toward me with the same calm expression he always seemed to wear. "Confirmation," he said. My stomach tightened. "Confirmation of what?" Before he answered, one of the men from earlier approached slowly from the far side of the row. He stopped several feet away and nodded once toward Vincent before glancing briefly at me. "Clear," he said quietly. Vincent acknowledged him with a slight nod, then returned his attention to me. "You are fortunate tonight," he said. I crossed my arms slightly. "That sounds like the beginning of a sentence I am not going to enjoy." Vincent rested one hand lightly on the roof of my car as he spoke. "If you had walked here alone, someone would have learned exactly where you live within the next hour." The words made my breath catch. "How?" Vincent pointed toward the small black device attached just behind the rear bumper, something I had not noticed until that moment because it blended almost perfectly with the shadow beneath the car. "That," he said simply. I stared at it for a second before the realization sank in. "That is not mine," I said quickly. Vincent's expression softened just slightly. "I know." My mind raced back through the evening, through the message Jason had sent asking where I parked. Through the strange way he had canceled the date only minutes before I arrived. You think he planned this? I said slowly. Vincent did not hesitate. I think someone expected to follow you tonight. I looked down at the small device again, a cold shiver moving through me despite the warm air in the garage. Why would anyone want to follow me? Vincent watched my reaction quietly before answering in a voice that remained calm, but carried a quiet certainty underneath. That, he said, is what we are going to find out. For a few seconds I could not move. The small black device under my car looked harmless, almost insignificant, yet the meaning behind it made the entire garage feel colder. I wrapped my arms around myself without realizing it. Someone wanted to track me, I said slowly, trying to hear the logic in my own voice. Vincent watched me carefully, measuring my reaction the same way he had measured everything else that night. Yes, he said calmly. But the important detail is that they expected you to leave the restaurant alone. I looked toward the ramp where cars occasionally passed below us, headlights sweeping briefly across the concrete walls. Jason knew exactly where I parked, I said quietly. Vincent nodded once, which means he either placed it himself earlier or told someone else where to find the car. I shook my head, struggling to process that idea. But that makes no sense. I only met him a few weeks ago. We went for coffee twice. That is it. Vincent crouched beside the bumper again, examining the device without touching it. Sometimes people are interested in someone for reasons that have nothing to do with romance, he said. Information, access, routine. Those things are valuable to the wrong kind of people. I leaned back against the side of my car, my pulse still a little too fast. You keep saying things like that as if you have seen this before. Vincent stood and brushed his hands lightly together, as if the answer was obvious. I have. The simplicity of that response sent another quiet ripple of unease through me. I looked again at the device under the bumper. What happens now? Vincent considered the question for a moment. One of the men from earlier walked slowly along the row of cars again, glancing briefly toward Vincent before continuing toward the stairwell. Everything about their movements looked casual to anyone passing by, but now that I was paying attention, I could see the careful rhythm in it. Vincent stepped closer to the rear of the car and finally reached beneath the bumper, his fingers finding the small magnetic edge of the tracker. With one smooth motion, he removed it and held it in his palm. The device was barely larger than a matchbox. That was easier than I expected, I said quietly. Vincent turned the object over once before slipping it into his jacket pocket. It is not the difficulty that concerns me, he replied. It is the intention. I exhaled slowly. So someone planned to follow me home tonight. That is the part one do not understand. I am not exactly a person with secrets worth stealing. Vincent leaned one shoulder lightly against the car beside me, his expression thoughtful now rather than analytical. People rarely realize when they are connected to something valuable, he said. I frowned slightly. Connected how? Vincent looked at me as if deciding how much to explain. Emily, what do you do for work? The question caught me off guard. I work for an accounting firm downtown, I said. Mostly financial reports and client audits. It is not exactly exciting. Vincent's gaze sharpened slightly. Large clients. I shrugged. Some. A few corporate accounts, some private investors. Vincent nodded slowly, as though another piece of a puzzle had quietly settled into place. Then it is possible tonight was not really about you, he said. I stared at him. That is supposed to make me feel better. It should, Vincent said calmly. Because it means someone else made a mistake. I folded my arms again. And what kind of mistake would that be? Vincent pushed away from the car and glanced toward the stairwell where the other men were already waiting. His voice dropped slightly, steady and certain. They chose the wrong person to watch. I felt my heart skip again, not from fear this time, but from the strange certainty in his tone. I looked at the tracker now hidden in his pocket and then back at him. Vincent, I said quietly, who exactly did I just meet tonight? He held my gaze for a moment before answering in the same calm voice he had used since the beginning of the evening. Someone who does not like strangers placing things on your car. I stared at Vincent for several seconds after he said that, waiting for the kind of explanation most people would give after a sentence like that. But Vincent did not rush to fill the silence. He simply stood there beside my car with the quiet patience of someone who was used to people adjusting to new information at their own speed. The fluorescent lights above us buzzed softly, casting long pale reflections across the concrete floor. Somewhere on the lower level a car door slammed, the sound echoing upward through the open center of the garage before fading again. That is not exactly a normal answer, I finally said. Vincent's expression shifted slightly, the faintest trace of amusement appearing at the corner of his mouth. Neither is finding a tracking device under your car after dinner. I let out a slow breath. Fair point. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My mind kept circling the same thought over and over. Jason had asked where I parked. Jason had canceled the date minutes before I arrived. And someone had placed that device on my car expecting to follow me home. I looked back at Vincent. You still think this is connected to my work? Vincent did not answer right away. Instead, he stepped away from the car and glanced toward the ramp again, where headlights briefly swept across the wall as another vehicle passed below. It is one possibility, he said. Another possibility is that someone believed you would lead them somewhere useful. Useful to who? I asked. Vincent looked back at me calmly. That is the question. One of the men who had been quietly circling the level approached again, stopping several feet away. He spoke quietly to Vincent, too low for me to hear clearly, but I caught a few words. No activity, entrance clear, cameras checked. Vincent nodded once in response before the man walked back toward the stairwell. I raised an eyebrow. Your friends are very thorough. Vincent glanced at me again. They prefer quiet evenings. I could not help a small laugh at that. Something tells me your definition of quiet is different from mine. Vincent's gaze softened just slightly. Tonight it is the same. I looked down at my car keys still resting in my hand. The silver key fob suddenly felt heavier than it had earlier in the evening when I had walked toward the restaurant expecting nothing more dramatic than a first date and a decent conversation. So what happens now? I asked. Vincent folded his arms loosely across his chest. Now you go home. I blinked. Just like that. Yes. Even though someone tried to track my car. Vincent's tone remained steady, which they can no longer do. I hesitated, glancing toward the garage exit. That still feels like a strange way to end the night. Vincent studied me for a moment before speaking again. Emily, if someone placed that device expecting to follow you, they will eventually realize it is no longer there. And then what? Then they will look for another opportunity. The thought sent a small chill through me again. You make that sound very certain. Vincent nodded once. People who make plans like that rarely give up after the first mistake. I tightened my grip on the keys slightly. That is not exactly reassuring. Vincent's voice softened just enough to take the edge off the statement. It is also why you will not be dealing with it alone. I looked up quickly. What does that mean? Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card, holding it between two fingers before handing it to me. The card was simple. White. No company name. No logo. Just a phone number printed neatly across the center. I turned it over once before looking back at him. You are giving me your number. Vincent shook his head slightly. A number you can call if something unusual happens again. And if nothing unusual happens. The corner of his mouth lifted again in that faint, almost smile. Then you had an interesting evening and met a stranger who likes chocolate cake. I slipped the card into my purse slowly, still watching him. Vincent, I said quietly. People do not usually bring 3 associates to protect someone they met an hour ago. Vincent held my gaze for a moment before answering. No, he said calmly. They do not. I waited, sensing there was more coming. Vincent glanced once more toward the garage entrance before returning his attention to me. But sometimes, he added quietly, they recognize when someone has just been placed in the wrong story. I stood beside the driver's door for a few seconds after Vincent said that. The words settling slowly in my mind. The wrong story. It was a strange way to describe what had happened tonight. Yet the more I thought about it, the more accurate it felt. 3 hours earlier, I had been worrying about whether a first date would be awkward. Now I was standing in a parking garage holding a card from a man who spoke like someone accustomed to problems appearing in the dark. I took a breath and opened my car door. The familiar scent of the interior greeted me. Leather and the faint trace of the coffee I had spilled 2 mornings ago during my commute. For a moment, the normalcy of it grounded me again. I slid into the driver's seat but did not start the engine yet. Vincent remained outside beside the door, one hand resting lightly on the roof of the car, as if making sure the moment did not move too quickly. I looked up at him through the open window. You still have not told me what kind of work you do? I said quietly. Vincent considered the question for a moment. The garage lights reflected softly across the dark surface of his watch as he folded his arms again. Logistics, he said. I raised an eyebrow. That is a very vague answer. The faint smile returned to the corner of his mouth. It is also a very accurate one. I shook my head slowly, amused despite everything that had happened. You have a talent for answering questions without really answering them. Vincent tilted his head slightly. And you have a talent for noticing details. I glanced toward the ramp where the two men were now standing near the exit, their presence subtle but unmistakably deliberate. Your logistics team seems very loyal, I said. Vincent followed my gaze briefly before looking back at me. They are good people. I hesitated for a second before speaking again. Vincent, if someone really was planning to follow me tonight, do you think they will try again? Vincent did not soften the truth. Yes, he said calmly. But they will not try the same method. I leaned back against the seat, letting that thought settle. You say things like that very confidently. Vincent's voice remained steady. Confidence usually comes from experience. The garage grew quiet again for a moment, the distant hum of traffic drifting in from the street outside. I finally pressed the start button, and the engine came to life with a soft vibration beneath the steering wheel. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and removed the small black tracker again, holding it between his fingers. You should drive home normally tonight, he said. Do not change your route. Do not act concerned. I looked at the device and then back at him. And what are you going to do with that? Vincent turned the tracker over once in his hand before slipping it back into his pocket. I am going to see who notices when it stops moving. The calm certainty in his voice made it clear he had already thought several steps ahead. I rested my hands lightly on the steering wheel, studying him through the open window. You know something? I said slowly. Vincent raised an eyebrow. What is that? Tonight was supposed to be the worst date I have ever had. His expression shifted with quiet curiosity. Supposed to be. I nodded once. Instead, I met a stranger who ordered me dessert, found a tracking device on my car, and somehow made me feel safer than I did 2 hours ago. Vincent did not immediately respond. The fluorescent lights above us flickered softly as another car entered the garage below. Finally he spoke, his voice lower than before. Emily, sometimes the worst plans lead people to the right moment. I held his gaze for a second longer, then slowly rolled the window halfway up. Good night, Vincent. He stepped back from the car as I eased it into reverse, watching carefully as I backed out of the space. When I shifted into drive and began moving toward the exit, I glanced once more in the rearview mirror. Vincent was still standing exactly where I had left him, calm and motionless beneath the white garage lights. And for reasons I could not fully explain yet, I had the strange feeling that the story that almost started tonight had quietly changed direction the moment he decided to sit at the table next to mine. I drove out of the garage exactly the way Vincent told me to, slowly and normally, like nothing unusual had happened that night. The ramp curved downward beneath my tires, and the bright city lights appeared ahead as I reached the street again. For a moment, I half expected something dramatic to happen, someone to follow me immediately, or a car to pull out behind me the second I turned the corner. But the street looked exactly like it always did on a Friday night. People walked along the sidewalks laughing with friends, taxis rolled past with their yellow lights glowing, and a couple waited outside the restaurant where the evening had started only hours earlier. If someone had planned something tonight, they were not making it obvious. I merged into traffic and followed the route I usually took home, my mind replaying everything Vincent had said. Do not change your route. Do not act concerned. It felt strange pretending the night had been ordinary when I knew it had not been. At the first red light, I glanced at the rearview mirror. A black SUV stopped 2 cars behind me, then a delivery van, then a sedan whose driver was busy talking on the phone. Nothing looked unusual, yet I caught myself watching the mirror again at the next intersection. By the time I reached the bridge that led toward my neighborhood, the city skyline shimmered across the river like glass reflections under the streetlights. The quiet rhythm of the road slowly steadied my breathing. Maybe Vincent had been right. Maybe someone had expected to follow my car, and now they simply could not. When I finally turned into my apartment complex, the familiar brick buildings and soft yellow courtyard lights felt reassuring in a way they never had before. I parked in my usual spot near the entrance and sat there for a moment with the engine running. The evening felt distant now, like a story someone else had told me rather than something I had lived through myself. Yet the white card in my purse was very real. I reached over and pulled it out, turning it between my fingers. Just a number. No name. No company. No explanation. I wondered briefly what kind of life produced people like Vincent. The kind of man who noticed details before anyone else, who brought associates without making it obvious, and who spoke about danger the way most people talked about the weather. I finally turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The night air felt calm and cool as I walked toward the front entrance of my building. The lobby lights glowed warmly through the glass doors, and the quiet hum of the city drifted through the trees nearby. For the first time since leaving the restaurant, I felt something close to normal again. Inside my apartment, I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and kicked off my shoes, letting the quiet settle around me. My phone buzzed suddenly against the counter, and my heart jumped before I even looked at it. A text message. For half a second I expected Jason's name to appear again. Instead, the number was unfamiliar. I opened the message slowly. It contained only a single sentence. Drive home safe. I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. I typed 2 words and hit send. I did. The reply came almost immediately. Good. I leaned back against the counter, staring at the quiet kitchen around me while the events of the night replayed again in my mind. Someone had tried to follow my car. Someone had expected me to leave the restaurant alone. And somehow a man I met by accident had noticed everything before it even happened. I set the phone down and walked toward the window overlooking the courtyard. The soft lights below illuminated the parked cars and quiet sidewalks of the complex. For a moment, everything looked perfectly peaceful. But the thought Vincent had left me with lingered quietly in the back of my mind. Sometimes people are placed in the wrong story. As I watched the courtyard lights flicker gently against the pavement, I realized something that made the evening feel very different than it had a few hours earlier. Tonight, I might have walked into the wrong story. But Vincent Romano had clearly decided that meant the story was not finished yet.